In the name of Allah, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful. All praise is due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful, sovereign of the day of recompense. It is you we worship, and you we ask for help. Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. Guide us to the straight path, the path upon those whom you have bestowed favor, not of those who have earned your anger, or of those who are astray. Welcome back to the Dr. Bob YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be doing a book review, another book review, of the eminent historian Tom Holland's work from around a decade ago called In the Shadow of the Sword. In it, he discusses the rise of Islam and its origins, and I think it is a topic that, while slightly different from the ones that we've discussed before on the channel, I think it gels nicely with the theme of what I'm trying to do on this channel. And there are a lot of important issues at stake. I'm going to read, to start out, the foreword of the Sahih International edition of the Quran to set the stage and to frame the discussion that I'm going to be doing today. So, starting with the foreword of the Sahih International edition, the top line is Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. No person can afford to be ignorant of the Quran, for it is the constitution revealed by God to regulate and govern human life. It speaks with the perfect knowledge of the Creator about his creation. It exposes the truth and invites man to the way of truth. It contains important information about human destiny and that of the individual. It educates and raises men to the highest moral, intellectual, and social level when they strive to comprehend it and apply its teachings to life. It is an eternal miracle, a proof of Muhammad's prophethood, and a challenge to all succeeding generations. It is of unique and inimitable quality. Revealed 14 centuries ago, it remains today completely intact and unaltered in its original Arabic form. In the early 1800s, there was a man by the name of Ferdinand Bauer, whom we have discussed on this channel before. Now, Dr. Bauer was a professor at the University of Tübingen in Germany. Following the cultural, historical, religious ideas of his day, Dr. Bauer was credited with being the first to found the field of what we call higher criticism today, especially in the context of biblical studies. Before Dr. Bauer, while there were certainly skeptical scholars, especially in the Renaissance period, no one had come to the point that Dr. Bauer had of questioning the entire basis of biblical revelation and the scriptures upon which the entire foundation of the Christian faith stood. We've been battling here in the secular West for nearly 200 years now between those who believe in the divine inspiration of the Holy Scriptures as the traditional historic Christian faith is taught versus those of a more skeptical bent who approach not only the text but the study of its origins from a purely secular, naturalistic, humanistic point of view. These are the biases that we in the postmodern West, especially in the academy, bring to the discussion of the Bible. When Edward Gibbon, sort of pivoting off of not only Dr. Bauer's work, but the skeptical zeitgeist of his age, wrote his eminent work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he blamed much of the fall of the Roman Empire on the Christian religion. And he took a skeptical eye to the authorship of various Pauline epistles, of the Gospels, of Moses and the Old Testament writings. However, when Mr. Gibbon took a look at Islamic and especially Quranic history, there had been so little scholarship done from an academic perspective on the sources of what he would have called Mohammedanism at the time in the 1800s, that he and many of his colleagues who were working in Germany or Britain or France at the time, they just took the presuppositions underlying Islam and its historical sources, the Quran, the Tafsir, the Sirah, and the Hadith, on face value. It was assumed that since Islam came around in the 600s, that it was born in the, quote, full light of history, so to speak. Unlike the Bible, which had its origins in the depths of antiquity in regards to the Old Testament, and then in the classical age in regards to the New Testament. The Quran was born during the time in history that has now come to be known as late antiquity. In Western Europe by that time, the Middle Ages were already upon the British Isles and Gaul and Hispania, the area formerly known as Magna Germania by the Romans. These areas had already seen the rise of feudalism and the beginnings of what we would think of as the medieval world. However, in the Eastern Mediterranean, where Constantinople, the city built upon Byzantium's foundations by Constantine the Great, that still controlled Anatolia and the Levant and Egypt and the eastern half of the Mediterranean, the Roman world was still very much alive. And to the east, the great and powerful Persian Empire under the Sasanian dynasty still warred with the Roman Empire as it had for nigh on 4 centuries by that point, and pushing it back all the way to the time of Parthia, nearly 600 years of continual border skirmishes and warfare with Rome continued as if nothing had happened, as if the events that had led to the downfall of the western half of the Roman Empire were inconsequential. So this is the historical background that Tom Holland broaches at the beginning of his book, In the Shadow of the Sword. As I read the foreword to the Sahih International edition of the Quran, the traditional understanding of what the Quran is, especially from the perspective of Sunni Islamic orthodoxy, is that the Quran is an uncreated, revealed, eternal miracle, unaltered in its original classical Arabic, sent down from a golden altar in heaven by the angel Gabriel to a man from the Hijaz named Muhammad during the last week of Ramadan, and most especially during the Night of Power. But is this what the Quran is, as Islamic tradition today claims it is, or is the Quran something entirely different? Is it something less eternal and less sent down from God in heaven? And maybe is it something more grounded in history, especially this era of late antiquity? This is what Tom Holland sets out to discuss in the book In the Shadow of the Sword. Now, how I came across this book, I think I have to start back all the way in college, maybe even before then, all the way to middle school. I remember sitting in my sixth grade reading class early in the morning on September 11th, 2001, and seeing an excited teacher turn on the television that was up in the upper right-hand corner of our classroom, and I can't remember if it was Fox or CNN or what cable news show it was, and seeing the towers burning, the first tower, and then seeing the second plane fly into the second tower on live television. To me, I still look back upon that day and now reviewing my own life and as an American, what it means in American history as well as global history, that the order that had been established by the United States in the post-Soviet world, that sort of 10 blessed years of peace, even though there were certainly problems during those 10 years, the global stage was relatively quiet. The decade immediately preceding the fall of the Soviet Union had finally given way to something entirely else. I really do see today, September 11th, 2001, not just as a day that forever changed the world, but as a day that showed how much the world had already changed. Demographic trends that had started immediately in the aftermath of the end of the Second World War in 1945 as it relates to mass immigration, the decline of birth rates in the civilized world, the industrialized world, the resurgence of the religion of Muhammad was something that had sort of been clouded over and obscured by the rivalry between the United States and the free and democratic world, so to speak, on one hand, and the communist world led by the Soviet Union and communist China on the other hand. And yet, in the quote-unquote third world, those nations neither aligned to the United States and Western Europe nor to the communist world, changes had already begun. The end of colonialism in Africa and South Asia, the birth of the nation of Israel in the Middle East, and the rise of the House of Saud to its great prominence that it holds today. All of these trends that Mr. Holland discusses in his book were already well underway by the time that September 11th had happened, and they had just come to the forefront through that. So my first encounter with Islam was on that day, understanding that there were people in an entirely different part of the world who had a different conception of who God was, an entirely different set of scriptures, different from what I knew in the Bible and in what was then a still relatively Christian West. Since that day, we have seen the continual decline of the Christian faith in Western Europe and the United States, the rise of secularism and atheism, but we've also seen an increasing encroachment by Islam once again on the Western world. So the issues that Mr. Holland discusses in his book are, I think, not only profound, but vital to what we deal with in our world today. So I found Tom's work by listening to a set of interviews that he had done on YouTube discussing his more recent work, Dominion, on how Latin Christianity had given birth to the modern world, and how he, as someone raised in an Anglican household, nominally so, in England, had fallen away from his Christian upbringing and had embraced secular humanism and had studied the Greeks and the Romans and classical philosophy of the Epicureans and the Stoics and the various schools of classical philosophy. But what he'd realized in studying the ancient Greeks and Romans was that the ideas that he thought had come from ancient Greece and ancient Rome had not, in fact, come from those civilizations in and of themselves, but rather from Christianity, which had arisen out of the Greco-Roman world. That what we think of as moral values in humanism today, such as universal human rights, women's rights, the dignity of the handicapped and the infirm, the treating of minorities with equal dignity as the majority population, that these are values and rights that do not come out of classical Greco-Roman philosophy or religion, but were deeply, deeply embedded in a particularly Christian worldview, and that secular humanism as it exists today is not in fact a new religion, but is a heresy of Latin, Western, Roman Catholic, and Protestant Christianity. And that to take the rise of secularism outside of its Western Christian beginnings is to completely misunderstand what secularism is altogether. But I did not know that he had written a book on Islam. Having been a fan of The Dividing Line for many years, I had heard Dr. James White discuss the so-called revisionist school of Islamic history before, but didn't know that Tom Holland was one of the, if not the main popularizer of this school that was first introduced to the world in scholarly form by Patricia Krona, a Danish historian who was unfortunately passed away a few years ago. I think it was 2015, 2016, sometime around there. From Denmark originally, but who had worked at Princeton University for a number of decades, researching the origins of Islam, and had worked sort of quietly behind the scenes in academia, even though she did have one popular work called Hagerism that was still relatively obscure. So when I listened to Mr. Holland's documentary, Islam, the Untold Story, that had been published for Channel 4 over in England, it sent a shockwave through me. I'd say would be one of those rare moments where my entire conception of something had been turned on its head. Not since I had really done a deep dive into Roman Catholicism and church history all the way back in 2011, which led to my interest in church history. That was after meeting a friend of mine in undergrad who would later try to enter the Catholic priesthood, and who challenged me as a Protestant on why I was not a Catholic. Not since that time had I sort of delved into a topic and it had my preconceptions so utterly blown away as by what Tom had discussed in his documentary. And I'll link to that documentary in the description. Actually, the opening song that I had for this video, Samuel Sims' Desert, theme was actually the opening and closing theme that Mr. Holland had for his documentary. So once again, I return to question prompted by reading the first chapter of the Quran, as I did earlier, Surah Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran. And that question is the Quran, with the opening paragraph of the foreword of the Sahih International Version claims it is, that is, an uncreated, revealed, eternal miracle, unaltered in its original classical Arabic, sent down by the angel Gabriel to a man named Muhammad? Or is the Quran an artifact of history that is deeply rooted in the history of the period of human history known as late antiquity? And it is those two questions that Mr. Holland sets out to answer in his book, and that I'll discuss in brief here. So the book itself, In the Shadow of the Sword, it has several subtitles, I think depending upon the versions. The first version, the subtitle was The Birth of Islam and the Rise of the Global Arab Empire. The second version I thought was a more interesting title, In the Shadow of the Sword, The Battle for Global Empire and the End of the Ancient World. As someone deeply interested in ancient Greco-Roman history and the history of the Roman Empire, it was always sort of a black hole for me how we went from sort of high classical civilization during the period of the five good emperors of Roman civilization, and the sort of slow downward ascent after the death of Marcus Aurelius, with the sort of one interlude of Constantine's reign, sort of reversing some of the losses and establishing Christianity as the Roman Empire's official religion, to the medieval world, and then from the medieval world onto the modern world. How did we get from Roman civilization as it existed then, which we share so much in common with today, but is still so alien and distinct from what we know today in the West? How did we get from that period in classical antiquity to where we are today? And that story cannot be told without the rise of Islam. That, as Mr. Holland alluded to in the second edition of his book, the subtitle thereof, The Battle for Global Empire, The End of the Ancient World, it really was the rise of the Arab Empire that led to the end of both ancient Rome and to the end of ancient Persia, and set us on a course to where we are today. But one thing that I think is a companion question to the two that I asked earlier is not just what is the Quran, but a question that he asks at the beginning of his documentary, Islam, the Untold Story, is how Muslim were the Arabs who founded the Arab Empire? Were they even really what we would define today as Muslim at all? Or is Islam something that arises out of the Arab Empire? That is, traditional Islamic history teaches that it was the teachings of the Prophet and the revelation that had been given to him by God that spurred the Arabs onward out of the deep deserts of Arabia to conquer half the known world, and to found this historically significant empire. But that's the narrative that Mr. Holland questions in his book. Perhaps it's not that there was a prophet named Muhammad who received revelation from God that then spurred on his Islamic followers with a newly created religion to found a newly established imperial order. But perhaps Islam is a retcon of the Arab Empire. just as we in the United States have a concept of manifest destiny, of ruling a nation from on the North American continent, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and this idea of manifest destiny becomes deeply ingrained in the psyche of the early American nation, especially in the settlers as they rush out into the great and wild West to found a new nation. Perhaps Islam is the manifest destiny of the Arab Empire, and is something that congeals and comes together later on, and that the religion that we know today is really the memoir, the evidence of the Arab conquest, rather than the cause of the Arab conquest. And so that's the question and the topic that Mr. Holland discusses in his book. So the structure of the book, it is 527 pages long, and there are 7 chapters divided into 3 sections. The first section, being an introductory section, has 1 chapter. The second section has, I believe, 5 chapters, and then the third section has, the second section has 4 chapters, and then the third section has 2 chapters. So there's 1 chapter for the first section, 4 chapters for the second section, and 2 chapters for the third section. Sorry for my tongue twisting. So we'll begin with an overview of the introduction. Chapter 1, Known Unknowns, and this is where Tom really begins to dive into the world into which the Arab Empire was birthed. He begins with discussing the story of Yusuf Asar Yafar, who was the last Jewish king of Himyar, which was a Jewish kingdom in modern-day southwestern Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Yusuf riding off into the Red Sea to drown as he saw his kingdom coming to an end with the Ethiopians invading from across the Red Sea, and how the story of Yusuf and the downfall of the kingdom of Himyar really is sort of a highlight of the age of late antiquity, the sort of apocalyptic fervor that had gripped the spirit of the age. And so I thought that was an interesting story that he discussed. So he sets the stage as to what late antiquity is. Late antiquity is sort of a recent construction in historical studies. It wasn't one that was used really before the 1970s. Everybody thought that, or had sort of ordered history as there was the Roman Empire, and then you have the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, and that really separates what we see as the ancient world as preceding it to what comes after it is the medieval world. But historians have started to take a more nuanced approach to that period in history, not seeing 476 as some sort of defining date. And for those of you who don't know, 476 is the year that the Gothic king Odoacer deposed the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustulus, who was actually a small child, and who had a fitting name, Romulus being the founder of the city of Rome itself, and Augustus being the founder of the empire. And so there was this almost poetic ending to the Roman Empire, at least in its Western form, in the year 476 AD. And so, as opposed to seeing that event as a sort of demarcation line, you really have to stretch back several hundred years before that, and even move forward several hundred years after that to see the transition from classical or high classical civilization under the Pax Romana into what we think of as the Dark Ages, or the beginnings of the medieval world, before we get to the High Middle Ages around the year 1000. Scholars typically see late antiquity today as being contemporaneous with the history of Sassanid Persia. And that's a period covering about 450 odd years or so, from the early part of the 3rd century to the middle part of the 7th century. And that the Middle Ages is sort of firmly established with the foundation of Al-Andalus in Spain, and the Battle of Troyes, and the rise of Charlemagne to found the Holy Roman Empire as being really the sort of definitive period in history in which we can say definitively that we're in the Middle Ages. Late antiquity starts with Ardashir I's defeat of, I believe it was Vologases IV at, let me see one second. Excuse me, I had to look up the history here. So late antiquity begins with Ardashir I, who was a Persian sort of client king under what was then the Parthian Empire, when he defeated the last Parthian king of kings, or the Shahanshah Artabanus IV, at the Battle of Ormazgan in 224. Ardashir overthrew the more decentralized Parthian Empire and established a much stronger, more centralized Sasanian Empire in Persia. No longer would Parthia be the junior sort of partner or antagonist to Rome, but the Shahanshah became every bit as powerful as Caesar in Rome. Around the same time, during that very same decade, Alexander Severus, who is the last ruler of the Severan dynasty, which we discussed in my review of the History of Rome podcast, he was the last of the Severan emperors. And with the end of the Severan dynasty, Rome entered into the crisis of the 3rd century. So within 11 years, in 224, we see Ardashir toppling Artabanus IV in Persia. And then just 11 years later, in 235, Alexander Severus is assassinated by his troops in the modern German city of Mainz, battling against the Germanic tribes. And over the next 50 years of Roman history, 26 different men held the Roman imperial purple, whereas the prior sort of 2 centuries had only seen about 15 to 18 legitimate emperors. So we see the transition of Rome away from its principate, in which the emperor was sort of seen as the senior-most colleague of the Senate, to, by the time we get to Diocletian, the Roman emperor is really nothing more than a king at that point. We begin to see the rise of feudalism during the crisis of the 3rd century, where the peasants are fleeing the cities to escape both barbarian invasions as well as taxation and plague onto the lands of the local nobility. And thus we see the rise and the beginning of feudalism in Europe at that time. So while there is a stabilization of the Roman Empire after the 50-year crisis, and there is sort of a stable, if always contentious, relationship between the Roman Empire, later the Byzantine Empire, as we have come to call it, with Sasanian Persia, what had come before in classical antiquity was never coming back. And so what late antiquity really is that period of transition, and it is a long, slow period of transition away from the ancient world that had sort of reached its culmination under Rome to the beginnings of the modern world in the medieval period. And so it's out of this period that we see the birth of this religion that we come to call today Islam. And so that's chapter 1, Known Unknowns. And it's really just Tom discussing this transition period of late antiquity, these 4 centuries of the end of the Severan dynasty, the rise of Sasanian Persia, to the end of both Rome and Persia and the rise of the Arab Empire. Section 2, he then moves into a discussion of what he calls jahiliya, that is ignorance in Arabic. This is a term that has come to be used in Islamic circles that translates roughly into English as the period of ignorance or the time of ignorance. And the idea is that before Islam, the world was living in ignorance. While, yes, there were the people of the book, the Jews and Christians, and that God had given his revelation from the world as a whole, but more specifically for the Arab peoples. They had dwelt in a time of ignorance. And so before Muhammad had been given his revelation, the Arabs were nothing more than squabbling tribes of polytheists who had no knowledge of God, almost analogous to the New Testament concept seen in Hebrews chapter 1, where the world had dwelt in ignorance until God sent his Son into the world. There's almost an analogous concept in Islam. But Tom shows in this book that contrary to Islamic popular conception that this was a time full of ignorance, that this period of late antiquity, the Jahiliyyah, was in fact a period full of culture and literature and antecedents that would later find themselves within the very fabric of the Islamic religion itself. And so in chapter 2, which is the first chapter in section 2 of the book, it is entitled Iran Shar, which is the Persian term for the Iranian world. That is the world dominated by the Iranic tribes. What we think of as sort of great or greater Persia. He discusses... he starts out the chapter by just recounting the story of Peroz I and his battle with the Hephthalites, who we in the West, historians refer to as the White Huns, and how Peroz, who is a Shah living, I believe, around the year 450 A.D., towards the end of the period of the Western Roman Empire, had been in a long war with nomadic tribes from Central Asia to the northeast of Iran, and he was trying to once and for all defeat these nomadic tribes and bring them back into the sphere of influence of Greater Persia. However, in spite of Peroz's pretensions as the Shahanshah, the King of Kings, a title that had gone all the way back to Cyrus the Great of biblical fame, he was defeated in an embarrassing fashion and most likely killed in this battle. The Persian cataphracti, the heavy cavalry, had been sent in to crush what appeared to be the retreating Hephthalite army from the battlefield, but the Hephthalites had actually set a trap in which pits had opened beneath the horses, and the cavalry ended up diving headlong into these pits that had been laid as a trap for the cavalry, and the White Huns had defeated the mighty Sassanid Persian army, and the Shahanshah himself was most likely killed in this battle. His body was never recovered. Very similar to Emperor Decius's defeat at Abritus by the Goths 200 years earlier, in which for the first time a Roman emperor had been killed on the battlefield against a foreign opponent. Very similarly, Peroz I became the first Shahanshah to be killed on the battlefield against a foreign, in this case, barbarian army. And so Tom uses that story as a backdrop to discuss the civilization that was Greater Persia, talking about the coalescence of the various Iranian-speaking tribes, the Medes and the Persians, and other smaller groups, the Parthians being one of them, into this great civilization under Cyrus the Great and the Achaemenid Empire that had come to be the world's foremost power at its founding. Cyrus's conquest of Babylon, and even all the way over into Asia Minor and into Judea and what we think of as modern Palestine and Israel. And that there was this great civilization that had existed that arose out of the greater Persian world. The founder of the religious aspect of this world was a man by the name of Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, as we came to transliterate it in the West, founding the religion that we know today as Zoroastrianism. Within Zoroastrianism, which really had a lot of antecedents in sort of prehistoric Iranian religion, that shared some similarities with Vedic Hindu religion in India, because they both arose out of the Indo-Aryan tribal migrations. That while Zoroaster's ideas were not necessarily novel, they were sort of a coalescence of many different kinds of beliefs that had been brewing and arising out of Iranian civilization up to that point. In his religion, in the Zoroastrian conception, there was the supreme god of light, Ormazd, or as it would be known in the original Persian, Ahura Mazda, which literally translates in Persian as the Lord of Light. This was the supreme god of the Zoroastrian religion. Underneath the rule of Ahura Mazda, there was a priesthood, the Maubeds, who were the sort of court religious counterparts to the Shahanshah. And Zoroaster taught that there was the sort of dualistic struggle between light and darkness, and that one day the world would be drowned in darkness, but would eventually be overcome by light. So you can see sort of, maybe some elements that later creep into Gnosticism that the early church battled against are found within Zoroastrianism. The Magi from the Nativity story were most likely holy men, or had some sort of official religious function within the religion that is Zoroastrianism. There was an emphasis upon almsgiving and prayer within Zoroastrianism that we'll later see finds its way into the Islamic religion. But whether or not Zoroaster actually historically existed, we're not sure. Very similar to the details of Buddhism and its founding. Zoroaster lived, thousands and thousands of years ago, before the time of Cyrus the Great, and there were a lot of legends and stories about him, but how much of his story is actually historical reality is kind of up in the air. But it's interesting nonetheless. And so this is the system that had been set up under Cyrus the Great. Zoroastrianism had become the official state religion of the Achaemenid Empire, but the toleration of other religions was allowed. So you had a number of different tribal gods and various other belief systems that were incorporated under the Achaemenid Empire. And it was thought that there was this world order and this world balance in which the Shahanshah, the King of Kings, was the leader of the world. And according to most demographic estimates, it's possible that up to 40% of the world's population at the time lived under the domination of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. However, something happened that sort of shook the foundations of Persian self-confidence and Persian self-perception. In the 330s, there was a young Macedonian king by the name of Alexander who set out not just to conquer, but to change the world forever. Alexander, who was a pupil of the great Greek philosopher Aristotle, not only overthrew Persian dominance in the Peloponnese and in the Greek-speaking world, but came to conquer the entirety of the Persian Empire. And as a foreign king, overthrew the Shahanshah and the dynasty that had centered Persia in world history. And so now world history had passed from Persian hands into the hands of the Greeks. And this was seen as a traumatic devastation to the Zoroastrian religious elite and religious establishment, that how could the Shahanshah, who was supposedly upholding the teachings and the religion of Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light, be overthrown and replaced by darkness and the embodiment of this foreign king, Alexander. And so forever after, the Greeks and then later the Romans became to be seen as the darkness to be opposed on behalf of Ormazd. And so Alexander rules the great empire, and it's interesting. There is one identifiable historical character in the Quran, Dhul Khunayn, and it's pretty obvious from the description of Dhul Khunayn that this figure was indeed Alexander the Great. I won't bother all the details at this point, but needless to say, Alexander had an earth-shattering and forever-altering impact upon world history. But Alexander dies at a young age, suddenly, and he has no heir. And so his empire is split up into 4 different kingdoms that later really sort of coalesce into 2 major kingdoms, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruling out of Egypt, and then the Seleucid Empire based both in Asia Minor and in Persia. And what happens is that the Seleucids and the Ptolemies fight a number of wars that weaken both of them. And the western provinces of the Seleucid Empire end up falling eventually to the rising Roman Republic. But the eastern provinces in Iran Shah itself fall to an Iranic tribe known as the Parthians. They had 7 great houses that later become the 7 great houses of Iran. The most important of those being the Qarin and the Mihran. And the Qarin and the Mihran really establish the Parthian Empire. And so Tom goes in to discuss the religion of the Qarin and the Mihran, which have a While influenced by Zoroastrianism, their religion based upon the god Mir, who rules from his angry mountain, is pre-Zoroastrian in its origins, and that the god Mir was sort of worshipped as the primary god of the Iranian peoples until Zoroaster comes along and then centered Ormazd or Ahura Mazda as the main god. But Mir actually comes into the Western world a few centuries down the line after the founding of the Parthian Empire in the eastern legions of the Roman Empire. The god Mithras is the sort of Hellenization of the Iranian god Mir. And so there is this tension between the Parthian nobility who worship Mir and pre-Zoroastrian Iranian gods and the Malbeds, the priesthood establishment of the Zoroastrians. And that there is always this tension. That tension is finally resolved when the Parthians are overthrown, as I mentioned, when Artabanus I is killed in battle by a Persian man, Ardashir V of Persis, who becomes Ardashir I of the Sassanid Empire, and reestablishes the Zoroastrian priesthood to its place of prominence in Sasanian Persia. After discussing the establishment of the Sasanian Empire, Mr. Holland then goes to discuss the early successes of this empire in reestablishing Iran Shah. After Ardashir dies, he is succeeded as Shahanshah by his eldest son, Shapur I. Shapur has an outsized role to play in the beginnings of late antiquity in his defeat of the Roman Emperor Publius Licinius Valerianus, also known as the Emperor Valerian, at the Battle of Edessa, which was the first time a Roman emperor had been captured in battle. Unlike Decius, just a few years earlier, who had died at the hands of the barbarian Goths, and which was seen as a catastrophe at the time, the capture of Valerian by what was quickly becoming an equal rival power to Rome in Sasanian Persia was seen as the high point of the crisis of the 3rd century. Shapur devastated the Roman East, going so far as to even besieging and possibly capturing the great Roman metropolis of Antioch near the Mediterranean coast. And so Shapur reigns for a very long period of time, multiple decades, and really establishes Iran and Iran Shah as a rival, a true legitimate rival to the Roman Empire. During the era of the Sasanian dynasty, especially as we start to get towards the latter periods of it, there's a number of heresies that have apocalyptic overtones that come to challenge the authority of the Sasanian Shahanshah and the Malbed Zoroastrian priesthood. The earliest of these was Manichaeism, which was an early rival of Christianity. Mani was a Persian living during the early years of the House of Sasan's rule over Iran, who preached a religion that had many elements of Zoroastrianism in it, but also blended teachings of early Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, as well as pre-Zoroastrian Islamic paganism, and also incorporated elements of Gnosticism as well, in which there was this struggle between light and darkness. Manichaeism later came to be persecuted in an official fashion by the Shahanshah and the official establishment of the Sassanid Empire. And so Manichaeism really spreads out into Rome, where it gains a number of followers, including St. Augustine in his early life was a Manichae. And also as far afield east as China. There's also another religion that arose later on called Mazdakism, which was Zoroastrian in its origins, but preached a form of primitive communism where its followers all shared their goods in common, and there was an air of trying to overthrow the established order and a coming apocalypse. And so Mazdakism, in a lot of ways, is really a foreshadowing of the momentous catastrophes that would beset both Rome and Iran Shar as we come to the latter part of late antiquity. And so with that, Mr. Holland ended off chapter 2 and moves into chapter 3, which is entitled The New Rome. And so he starts off this chapter by discussing the crisis of the 3rd century and the period of military anarchy between the assassination of Alexander Severus, as we mentioned earlier, and the rise of the Emperor Diocletian and the establishment of the Diocletian Tetrarchy, which finally ends the crisis period, the 50 years of crisis during the 3rd century. And so he discusses Diocles' novel idea of adopting a co-Augustus who is not related to him, named Maximian. And Diocletian rules in the east and Maximian rules in the west. And then both of them, as Augusti, co-Augusti, then adopt 2 heirs who are also not related to them, named Caesars. Diocletian adopts a man by the name of Galerius as his heir in the east. But Maximian adopts an even more outstanding junior colleague to be Caesar in the west, a man by the name of Constantius Chlorus. And for those of you who know history well, Constantius Chlorus is none other than the father of Constantine the Great. Mr. Holland then goes on to discuss the problems within the Tetrarchy and how both Maximian and Constantius' sons expect to be adopted as Caesars upon the abdication of Diocletian in the east and Maximian in the west. But instead of them being adopted, Diocletian sees that 2 unrelated men to either Constantius or Galerius are accepted as co-Caesars. So this leads to bitterness and resentment on the part of Maximian's son on the one hand, and then Constantius' son on the other hand, which leads to Maximian's son let me see, what was his name again? Yes, Maximian's son Maxentius. So Maxentius and Constantine are both passed over. Maxentius rebels, takes over Italy and North Africa, and Constantine, who was living in the court of Diocletian, flees after Diocletian abdicates because he fears that Galerius is trying to put him to death. And so Constantine flees Galerius' court in the east, and a very fascinating story about how he used the Roman postal system, and every time he got to a new post, he would hamstring the horse that he had ridden. And he does that all the way to Britain, where his, which is a journey of thousands of miles, and that he had done this in a very short amount of time using the Roman roads and the Roman postal system, which will become important for later in our review, to come to Britain, where he becomes a general under his father Constantius, and then when Constantius dies, Constantine's legions in Britain hail him as Augustus, and civil wars then ensue. And after a period of about 20 years, Constantine eventually defeats all of his rivals and becomes the sole Augustus and the sole Roman emperor once again. And after Constantine becomes sole Roman emperor, as some of you may know, there's the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where he's fighting outnumbered against the larger force of Maxentius outside the gates of the city of Rome. He supposedly sees a cross in the sky, and the voice of God saying, "In this sign conquer." And so Constantine defeats his rival Maxentius, and as legend says, becomes a Christian after that. And Rome is transitioned away, starting with the reign of Constantine and sort of culminating 60 years later during the reign of Theodosius I, as Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so Mr. Holland then goes into discussing Constantine's death and Constantine's heirs battling it out for the rule of the empire. Constantius II, being the middle of Constantine's three sons, eventually defeats his two brothers, and you see religious controversies. So you see the rise of Arianism and the establishment of Nicene Orthodoxy just a few decades later. And so Constantine had thought he had inherited a united Christian church, but far from the church being united, there were a number of heretical groups that existed, and so Constantine, who is seeking a unified religious order for his now unified empire, was sorely disappointed. But out of that, we get the Council of Nicaea and the antecedents for what later becomes medieval Christianity in its conciliar form, where you have powerful bishops and patriarchs, and really the solidification of Christian ecclesiology, which, as you guys know, I have debated before, during this period, and really the establishment of the imperial church. Tom then discusses Julian the Apostate, which he sees as sort of the last hurrah of paganism. He covers Julian's attempts to roll back Christianity and to codify certain aspects of paganism in order to give a rival structure of paganism to Christianity, but this fails not only because of Julian's untimely death in a war against the Persians, but also just by the nature of what Greco-Roman paganism was. It was never really one unified religion, but just a number, potentially in the hundreds, of different local cults and different cult religions that were primarily based around the person of the emperor in later decades and centuries. That did not really have a cohesive belief system the way that Christianity does. And so the death of Julian, who's also, interestingly or coincidentally enough, the last of the Constantinian dynasty, after Julian dies, you see the rise of the Theodosian and Valerianic dynasty, which then will go on to rule the Western Empire up until nearly the end of the Western Empire. But we also see with the death of Julian, and there's the loss of certain eastern sections of the very eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, especially the city of Nisibis, which had fallen in its finality to the Persian Empire. Nisibis, which had been contested hotly for 300 years between Rome and Persia, is permanently ceded to Persia by the Romans, which is important in church history because the church that had existed at Nisibis, which supported the Patriarch Nestorius, later on becomes the official church of the Persian Empire and is the church that we know today as the Church of the East, which it survives in a small denomination called the Assyrian Church of the East that held to a Nestorian Christology. And so you begin to see the first divisions even within what was considered Nicene Christianity, or Christians that would have held to the Nicene Creed of Constantine. You're starting to see a breakup, and this upon national lines, where the Christians who are living under the Persian Empire hold to a different Christology and a different church government compared to the Christians that were still living under Rome. Tom discusses the great councils of Christendom after Nicaea. That's Constantinople I and 381, where you have the establishment of the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. Ephesus 431, which is the condemnation of Nestorianism and the real, sort of establishment of the Church of the East in earnest at that point. And then Chalcedon in 451, where there is the condemnation of monophysitism or monophysitism, more phonetically speaking, where the majority of the Christians in Egypt, in the Egyptian province, held to a form of monophysitism and rejected the Council of Chalcedon. That's disputed today. Oriental Orthodoxy, which is what the Coptic Church, the Egyptian Church, is a part of, they deny that they're Monophysite, but nonetheless, for just historical context, they reject the Council of Chalcedon. And so now you have a number of different rival established churches. The Byzantine Church in the area around Constantinople, the Coptic Church in Egypt, and then the Persian Church of the East, or the Nestorian Church within Sasanian Persia. Mr. Holland then discusses the collapse of the Western Empire, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, and the loss of the Western provinces from imperial control, and the establishment of what we call today, anachronistically, the Byzantine Empire, which was really nothing more than the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, continuing into the Middle Ages. He comes to Justinian, who had a long, nearly 4-decade rule. And Justinian is an important figure, especially in discussion of the origins of Islam, for it's really in Justinian's reign that we begin to see the changes in late antiquity that will then give rise to Islam later on. Justinian is a pivotal figure in this period of late antiquity, really a focal point. He's the last of the Latin emperors, so he's the last Latin-speaking emperor in Constantinople. He came from, like so many of the emperors during the crisis period, and from Constantine's era as well. He came from Illyricum, the Danubian and Balkan provinces of the Roman Empire. And so he spoke Latin as his first language and not Greek, but he would be the last of the Byzantine Empire or emperors to speak Latin as his first language. He institutes a reconquista, the Western reconquista of the Byzantine Empire, where the provinces of Africa that had been lost to the Vandals during the time of St. Augustine were reconquered. So the great city of Carthage was finally reconquered in the name of the Roman Empire. The provinces in the Balkans are expanded, and the areas that had been lost are reconquered. And then finally, Justinian's most ambitious project was the reconquest of Italy, in which the Italian peninsula is finally brought back under Roman control. There's also a partial reconquest of southern Spain. And so Justinian really swells the land area once again of the Roman Empire to its greatest extent that had been seen since the time of Theodosius and his sons Honorius and Arcadius. But this has some negative consequences, as we'll see. Justinian has a very ambitious wife who is a former prostitute by the name of Theodora, who a lot of people say was the real power behind the throne. And Justinian establishes the Hagia Sophia. He goes on a great building campaign, establishing many of the great Eastern Orthodox churches that we see today. He has a war with Khusro, who was the Shahanshah in the Sasanian Empire, establishes a peace that's then broken, that leads to another war. He has a very interesting professional relationship with his general Belisarius, who is the last great Roman conqueror. Belisarius being instrumental in many of Rome's western reconquest at that point. But there are some problems that we'll see in later chapters that Justinian really, his reign brings into focus. So with that, Mr. Holland concludes his discussion of the New Rome and the establishment of the Byzantine Empire as we know it historically today. And then he moves into chapter 4, which he titles The Children of Abraham. And so now Mr. Holland has given us the background of Iran and Greater Persia. He's given us the background of Rome. And now he's going to give us the background of the peoples of the Near East, the Semitic peoples of the Near East, who are the foundation of what later becomes the Arab Empire. So at first, he discusses Judaism and discusses a brief history of the Jews, discussing the Babylonian captivity, the destruction of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple, the destruction of the Second Temple, and the scattering of the Jews throughout the Roman Empire as well as the Persian Empire as well, discussing the importance of the Jewish diaspora, the beginnings of rabbinic Christianity, rabbinic Judaism, based upon the diaspora. He discusses the origins of the Talmud, especially the Babylonian variety of the Talmud, which came into existence under Sasanian Persian rule in the great city of Babylon. And discusses, how Judaism adapted from being a temple-based religion to being a rabbinical-based religion after the destruction of the Second Temple. He then also discusses briefly the origins of Christianity, discussing the life of Christ, the stories of his resurrection, the journeys of the Apostle Paul and the other apostles of Jesus, the state-sponsored persecution at the hands of the Roman emperors for the first 250 years of Christianity's existence, discussing the beginning of monasticism due to the persecution, and then the eventual triumph of Christianity over paganism, as seen with the Constantinian reforms and then the official establishment under Theodosius I in 381 as the official religion of the empire. But then Mr. Holland gets into a very interesting discussion of the Arab tribes. And this is very significant as he started to move beyond the imperial frontiers out into areas that were no longer controlled by either the Romans or the Persians, and discusses the people who lived just beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire as well as the boundaries of the Persian Empire. When we think of barbarians in association with the Roman Empire, most of us probably think of the movie Gladiator or the like, where we think of, Germanic tribes with, animal, skin clothing and, horned helmets, fighting in some snowy northern European waste against the armies of Caesar, doing constant warfare and battle with the Romans, sort of tall, blonde, blue-eyed, light-skinned barbarians fighting against the empire, as well as some of those tribes coming under the influence of the Caesars and actually being allies of the Roman Empire against their barbarian brethren. The so-called foederati, or the federated tribes that the Romans had subjugated and who would also oftentimes rebel against Roman rule. And so we typically, when we think about that from a Western point of view, we think about Germany, we think about the Slavic tribes, we think about, Celtic tribes and, Britain as well. Especially up in Germany, we think about, the sort of precursors to the Vikings, that these were the tribes that were doing battle with the Romans. However, Rome did not only subjugate tribes beyond its frontier or put them in sort of a federated or tributive relationship in Northern Europe. On Rome's eastern frontier, especially in the deserts of modern-day northern Saudi Arabia, southern Israel, Jordan, Iraq, there were a number of Arab-speaking tribes who also, at various times, were at peace with, in a tributary relationship with, or at war with their Roman overlords. And this was not only with the Roman Empire, but the Persians as well, on their western frontier, had Arab tribes, or tribes speaking variants of the Arab language, who were in a tributive relationship with the Shahanshah. Over time, just as many of the Germanic tribes began to coalesce into larger national confederations in Northern Europe, a number of the Arab tribes began to coalesce from small tribal bands into large confederacies of tribal groupings. The two most important of these, especially during the sort of period between the fall of the Western Empire and the rise of the Arab Empire, were one large tribal grouping that was affiliated and confederated with the Romans, the Ghassanids, and then another large tribal grouping to their east that were allies of the Persians named the Lakhmids. The Lakhmids are the first that Mr. Holland discusses, talking about their great king Mundir and his descendants. These were pagans who were indeed polytheistic, and they have a number of very interesting features, such as the worship of worship in sanctuaries that are shaped like cubes, and the worship of goddesses whose names actually enter into the Quran and the satanic verses. I believe that's Manat and Al-Uzza and one of the other goddesses that are mentioned in the Quran were worshipped by the Lakhmids. And as I mentioned, they were loyal to the Shahanshah of the Sasanian Persian dynasty. And they were a great terror on the eastern frontier of the Byzantine Empire, causing the deaths of many legionaries and the razing of many Roman cities. And so to counter the threat of the Lakhmid Arab tribes, the emperor in Constantinople found a Christian Arab tribe that he allied to himself, who would do battle with the Lakhmids. And that was the house of Hassan, or what we call the Ghassanid or Hassanid Arabs. They were Monophysites. They were allied with the church in Egypt, but they remained loyal to the emperor in Constantinople. And so as a Christian Arab tribe, they did battle with the pagan Arabs who were allied with the Persians. Many of them became famous monks, and they would support monks who were out in the deserts. And the Hassanid king actually, I believe, held the position of senator within the Byzantine government. And so the Christian kings of the Ghassanids were very important politically in the early Byzantine Empire. And so after discussing Jews and Christians and the various Arab tribes and the culture of those Arab tribes, Mr. Holland then begins his transition into discussing the origins of Islam. In the last chapter of Section 2, Jahiliyyah, or the Age of Ignorance, he discusses the countdown to apocalypse and the very apocalyptic overtones that begin to arise within late antiquity. The first of which occurs in the 540s, which is the arrival of the Great Plague. While Justinian's conquests had reestablished Roman imperial authority over many of the western provinces of the former Western Roman Empire, he had overstretched his military resources and had overstretched and burned out the Roman treasury. And by the reestablishment of many trade routes as well, he also offered a conduit for a vector of disease. Rome had been struck by a number of plagues throughout its history. The most famous of during the sort of United Imperial period was the Great Antonine Plague of the 160s AD during the early years of the reign of Marcus Aurelius, named after his father, his adopted father, Antoninus Pius, who had been the emperor before him. And so the Antonine Plague was really the beginnings of the end of the Roman Empire. And the life of Marcus Aurelius is definitely worth studying, but is beyond the scope of this video. He was really the last great pagan Roman emperor. Maybe you could throw Diocletian or Aurelian in there, but the last great emperor of the Pax Romana. And the Pax Romana is traditionally dated as ending, or the end date of the Pax Romana is typically assigned to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. But Marcus not only had to deal with barbarian invasions in the Marcomannic Wars to his north, but also the Great Antonine Plague, which some estimate wiped out as much as 10 to 15% of the Roman population. And some would say is actually the first pandemic recorded in history. We don't know what the Antonine Plague was. As a doctor, I'm quite interested in the history of it. The most likely candidates are either smallpox or measles, which would make sense. But that was the first great plague. A century later, there's the plague of Cyprian, who some people theorize could even be something like Ebola or another related filovirus. But none of those, as bad as they were, would compare to the Great Plague that came during the time of Justinian, that we know as the Plague of Justinian. A few years ago, there were a number of scientists who had actually found bodies from plague pits dated to the reign of Justinian. And they had done DNA analysis and had actually been able to extract the DNA of the microorganism that caused the plague of Justinian. And to their surprise, it was actually the pathogen Yersinia pestis. For those of you with medical knowledge or you're just a history buff, Yersinia pestis is the same pathogen that caused the Black Death nearly 800 years later during the Middle Ages, which really led to the end of the Middle Ages and the beginnings of the period of the Renaissance. So the same organism, the same pathogen, the same plague that would be written about in such detail 800 years later, the Black Death, had actually entered into the known world 800 years earlier as the plague of Justinian. The plague, I believe, arose in Egypt in the city of Pelusium, and then spread to Alexandria, and then traveled via ships where rats had stowed away to Syria and Asia Minor, Greece, to Italy, then spreading all throughout Europe, and even hit the Persians as well. And so both Rome and Persia were devastated by the plague of Justinian. This halted Justinian's reconquest. He was trying to conquer the rest of Spain and even go in and conquer the Frankish kingdom. But due to the depletion of his armies, the depletion of the treasury, Justinian's conquests were halted, and Roman ambitions to reconquer the entirety of the Western Empire were stalled once and for all. And when I read the opening chapter of the Quran at the beginning of this broadcast, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned, I believe it's in verse, this would be ayat number 6 of Surah Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran. I read the Arabic word, the Arabic translation, or the Arabic original of this translation, guide us to the straight path, as Idina as-Sirat al-Mustaqim. And what's significant about this, and Mr. Holland discusses this, the Arabic word for path, sirat, is not an Arabic word in its etymology. It actually comes from the Latin word strata, which was the name for the Roman roads. So the Roman roads were called the strata, the idea that they're a pavement that had spread out upon the ground, and that these Roman roads were not only significant for travel within the Roman Empire, or even in barbarian Europe, where the Germanic and Celtic tribes had used Roman roads to do trade with the Romans, but also in the Roman East, and in the areas of those Arabic-speaking tribes that were confederated to the Roman Empire, immediately beyond the borders of the Roman East in the desert, that the desert caravans used the Roman strata as a way to guide them to the great cities of Syria and Palestine and Egypt, Alexandria and Damascus and Antioch and Jerusalem, for trade. But due to the plague, and due to the exhaustion of the treasury, and due to the constant wars with Persia, the Roman strata that existed on the just beyond the borders in the Arabian desert began to be abandoned and covered over with sand. And so you can imagine, you're now starting to see the sort of cultural antecedents for what gave rise to the Quran, and the concerns of the author of the Quran, the concerns of those Arabs living during late antiquity, this sort of apocalyptic, tone of, there's all this bad stuff that's going around. The roads are being abandoned. There's plague. There's war. To a lot of people during that time, it really did seem like the end of the world. And so for the Arab who depends upon trade with Roman Syria and Roman Palestine, with Roman Egypt, to see the disappearance of the roads would have been devastating to their livelihood and to their very way of life. And so you can see where Arabs, who are now being influenced by Christianity and Zoroastrianism and the concept of early monotheism in the Arab world, would want God to guide them to the strata, to guide them to those roads by which their livelihood depended. And so when the physical manifestation of this world begins to disappear because of the breakdown of empire, there's a yearning and a desire for God to provide a straight path, not only for sustenance in this life, but sustenance and salvation in the life hereafter. And so the end of late antiquity, from the rise of the plague of Justinian around 540, we begin to see the world, in a sense, coming to an end. The world as people had known it, the Roman order, the Persian order, starting to come to an end. And that culminates in the war that ends the ancient world, as it has been called. The Great War of 602 AD to 628 AD, the last Roman-Persian war. So there's a lot of background to this war. And it starts with palace intrigue, as many important events in history often do. I think back to the assassination of Pertinax. Immediately after the strangulation of Commodus, Pertinax, who is the urban prefect, essentially the mayor of Rome and one of Marcus Aurelius' right-hand man, he tries to restore order to the Praetorian Guard and roll back the craziness of Commodus's reign, but he's assassinated because the Praetorian Guard feels that he's sort of skimped them on the money that they believe is owed, and so they assassinate Pertinax. That leads to the Year of the Five Emperors, and then eventually, because of the events that happen in the Year of the Five Emperors, that leads to the crisis of the 3rd century, and eventually to the very dissolution of Rome itself many centuries later. So there's a palace coup against the young Persian heir to the throne named Khusro II. Khusro is deposed. I believe it's either his father was assassinated or something had happened where his position on the Persian throne was threatened, and he flees to Rome. He actually flees to Constantinople to the Byzantine emperor, who gives the young Khusro II amnesty. The Byzantine emperor at the time, Maurice, who is considered a good Byzantine emperor by most, shelters Khusro and allows Khusro to gain his following back and strength to launch a counter coup against the Shah who had overthrown him. So Khusro is able to go back to Persia. He overthrows the usurper and is established as the Shahanshah, and he has a good relationship with Maurice, the emperor in Constantinople. However, Maurice is then, speaking of palace coups, assassinated by his guard, and a usurper, a pretender by the name of Phocas, comes to power. This angers Khusro, and seeing his opportunity and egged on by the Zoroastrian establishment, the Malbeds, the priesthood, he finally decides that it's time for the religion of the Lord of Light, of Ahura Mazda, to once again prevail over the provinces that had once been ruled by the Achaemenid Empire. And so he seeks to not only take back the provinces that had been lost, but to end the Roman Empire once and for all. And so Khusro goes on a campaign, and at first is very successful, to the point where the Persian army comes all the way up to the very gates of Constantinople itself. They capture Syria, they capture Palestine, they capture Egypt. And it seems that Rome is doomed. That Constantinople will be captured, and that Iran Shah will once again become the focal point of history. However, after Phocas is killed, a heroic figure comes to the fore in Roman history, a man of great legend whose highest of high, the ecstasy of victory that Heraclius achieves, is only overshadowed by the great defeats that he would suffer after his great victory. The story of Heraclius, Emperor Heraclius, is to me one of the incredible, gut-wrenching tragedies in all of history. A man who won total victory, defeated all of his enemies, only to have an unknown enemy come out of nowhere and leave him defeated. So Heraclius, launching an insurgency from the mountains of Armenia, drives the Persians out. He cuts them off in Anatolia, and Khusro's army begins to starve, and so they have to retreat. And the barbarians that Khusro had bribed to besiege Constantinople from the north have to withdraw as well. And so Heraclius drives out the barbarians, the Avars and the Huns, who had been allied against him, from the north, recaptures all of the areas in the Balkans that had once belonged to Rome. And after he does that, he reestablishes Roman rule in Anatolia. And then he goes down into Mesopotamia and sacks Ctesiphon, the Persian capital itself. Going literally from the brink of defeat at the hands of Khusro all the way to total victory. He actually captures the family of the Shah. And Heraclius finally has Khusro executed. Khusro is captured by one of his generals. There had been a revolt against Khusro's rule. I believe it was by his general Shabaraz, and Shabaraz and Heraclius come to the negotiating table, and all Roman territory that had been captured by the Persians was given back, and that included a war indemnity. And Khusro II, I believe, is either killed in prison or dies of dysentery. And so Heraclius literally brought Rome from the brink of utter defeat to the high of total victory. But as great as Heraclius' victory was, the recapture of the true cross in Jerusalem that was then paraded in triumph in Constantinople as a sign of the Christian religion's victory over pagan Persia, in the end, it's all for naught. And so that concludes Section 2, Jahiliyyah, and brings us into Section 3, Hijra, the last two chapters of the book, in which Tom discusses the aftermath of the Great War, which truly was the greatest war in history, not in the sense of its nobility, but in the sense of its impact on history. I would say even more so than what we in the modern world call the Great War, World War I, that the last Roman-Persian War forever altered human history by ending the last remnants of classical civilization and leaving both Rome and Persia exposed to external invasion, which is what Mr. Holland discusses in his next section, Section 3, Hijra. Chapter 6, More Questions Than Answers. It is recounted in Islamic histories that after the Prophet had received revelation from God and had been given the Quran, that he went to his fellow tribe, the Quraysh, who had ruled Mecca, to preach to them the way of Islam, but that he was rejected and driven out. The Hijra is the flight of the believers, the Prophet and his followers, from Mecca to Medina, and that the beginning of Islamic history and the beginning of the Islamic calendar starts with the flight from Mecca to the city of Yathrib, which later becomes the city of Medina, the city of the Prophet. And that this is the focal point of all history from the Islamic perspective. It's the reception of revelation, the preaching in Mecca, the being driven out of Mecca, and the flight from Mecca to Medina, the Hijra. However, the earliest Muslim source that we have for the life of Muhammad is from a man by the name of Ibn Hisham, that is the son of Hisham, who compiled an earlier work by a man named Ibn Ishaq. And that compilation is from the year 830 AD, which is about 2 centuries after the death of the prophet. Ibn Ishaq had allegedly written around 750 AD, which is still about 120 years after the time of Muhammad. For comparison, the earliest Gospels, even the most radically secular scholars would say 60s or 70 AD, which is only about 30 or 40 years after the time of Jesus, and well within the living memory of Jesus' followers. So I think that comparison is important. In contrast to Gibbon's dismissal of Christianity and the dismissal of the Gospels, along with the Tübingen School as being written later, archaeological evidence, especially in the discovery of the papyri manuscripts, has shown that the Gospels, especially as we have come to understand more of the first century Pax Romana world of the Eastern Mediterranean, just how deeply grounded in the history of the age the Gospels and the epistles were. Whether or not one believes the supernatural aspects of the Gospels, the epistles, and the Acts of the Apostles, even the most radical skeptical scholars today do concede that these works are indeed based in the middle 1st century Greco-Roman world of the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's in opposition to the many Gnostic Gospels and other Christian writings which come later. And so that this history is in fact the basis for why we have the New Testament canon that we have. There's a great book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I forget the name of the author, but I'll look it up and try to put it in the description, that talks about the historical reliability of the New Testament and the definitive cultural grounding that the New Testament has within the culture upon which it purports to be from. Compare all of those facts, and especially the fact that we have 57, almost 5,800 Greek manuscripts and over 10,000 Latin and Syriac and Armenian and second language translations of the New Testament Gospels. Compare that with the almost total lack of Muslim contemporaneous sources that we have on the life of Muhammad, most of which were written centuries later during the Abbasid Caliphate. This is important to note. The earliest sources for what we call Islam today actually come from non-Muslim sources. Christian bishops and monks, Jewish rabbis, Zoroastrian priests, all describe the Arab conquest of the Christian Near East and Zoroastrian Persia, giving details that sound familiar but are different than the traditional Islamic narrative that we find in the Sirah and in the Hadith. For instance, a Christian bishop writing from Syria discusses the king of the Arabs, who almost has this prophetic-like, aura about him, conquering the Holy Land in 634 AD. But the Islamic narrative has the prophet dying in 632 AD. A curious discrepancy. Non-Muslim sources both affirm certain aspects of the traditional Islamic narrative, but they contradict it in many, many ways. There's a Frankish pilgrim who writes an account of Jerusalem after the Arab conquest, who describes the sort of shabby, tent sanctuary that had been set up on the Temple Mount. That was a place of prayer for the Arabs, but he mentions nothing of the 5 daily prayers, the giving of alms, all of the things that we associate with Islam today, the Shahada, none of that is mentioned. Furthermore, the traditional geography in the Hadith literature doesn't match what we see in the Quran itself. Mecca is mentioned just once in the Quran and is not really described as a city, but as something more of like a valley where there's agriculture and cattle and date palms. The modern city of Mecca, and especially the area around it, can't support the kind of agriculture that is described in the Quran itself. There's also a description in the Quran itself of the nearness of sites of Abraham that were located in the area of the Dead Sea, in modern-day southern Israel and Jordan. Another curious contradiction. The mushrikun, the disbelievers of the Quran, don't match the sort of polytheistic, idol-worshipping Arabs of later Hadith and Islamic literature. They appear to be pastoralists and farmers, not deep desert dwellers and camel traders. Instead of being polytheist, what they more so seem to be are syncretic monotheists, people who worship the one true God, but may have saints or angels or other associates of God himself, not outright idol-worshipping pagans. And most eerily, the early qiblas, which are the stations in the masjid that point to the direction of the sanctuary, the house of Baha, as it is mentioned in the Quran, which is the sanctuary that was established by Muhammad. They don't point to the modern city of Mecca. There's been a number of works done on this by a scholar by the name of Dan Gibson, who offers the site of Petra in modern Jordan. Some say that they point towards Jerusalem, but it's clearly they're pointing to the area just outside of what would have then been the Eastern Roman Empire, and they're not pointing to deep desert Arabia. And so this is why Mr. Holland titles this chapter More Questions Than Answers. I must say it's too much to cover here in a review itself, which is why I'm linking not only the book, which I highly recommend for all, which is why I'm doing the review, but also Mr. Holland's documentary, Islam, the Untold Story, in that it's not that we have definitive answers that the traditional Muslim sources are definitively wrong. It's just that we don't know. It's not well attested. Which is why I mentioned, in contradiction to Edward Gibbon's description of Islam being born in the full light of history, it's actually the opposite case. It's Christianity that is born in the full light of history. And that due to the apocalyptic happenings of the period of late antiquity, it's actually Islam that is not born in the full light of history, and that seems to mysteriously come out of the deserts of Arabia. Chapter 7 is the final chapter in which Tom offers some very controversial remarks based upon the earlier work of Patricia Crona and Fred Donner and other scholars of revisionist Islamic thought. And he titles this The Forging of Islam. He discusses the companions of Muhammad, Umar, who seems to be almost like a Christian monk, living out in the deserts and warring against all forms of heresy the way that the monks did during the Christian Roman Empire. He discusses the rivalry of Abu Bakr versus Ali and the Caliph Uthman and his alleged burning of variant manuscripts of the Quran, which we see today in the Sa'ana palimpsest, which, contrary to the foreword of the Sahih international version of the Quran, potentially indicates that there is a textual tradition of the Quran that, just in the way that skeptical scholars engage with the Bible on the basis of historical criticism, higher criticism, as I've discussed before on this channel, the Quran can also be subject to textual criticism and has a textual history that is different than the product that we have today. Tom discusses the rise of the Umayyads, who are the victors in the first fitna, which is the first civil war that arises out of the Rashidun Caliphate, the rightly guided caliphate. He talks about Muawiyah I, whose coins are influenced by a Sasanian style in that his face is actually pictured very similar to Roman emperors and Sasanian Shahanshahs. He rules from Syria and Damascus, not from Mecca or Medina. He's considered to be the first not rightly guided caliph, and he has conflicts with the followers of Ali. There's talks about or discussion about the early Umayyad caliphs who have monkeys and exotic animals and, belly dancers and drink alcohol, and that the Umayyads, who had expanded the Arab Empire beyond the desert frontiers outside of Rome to the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula, to Roman Syria, to Egypt, to Palestine, to Persia itself. As I mentioned earlier about Heraclius being a tragic figure, it was under his reign after the Great War where he had finally defeated the Persians once and for all within just a couple of years of this great victory. The Arab armies are invading Roman territory, and the exhausted Roman legions are unable to stop the onslaught and are powerless to prevent the conquest. The same with Shabaraz and his successors to the House of Sasan. They are powerless to stop the sacking of Ctesiphon and the great cities of Persian antiquity. As the Arab armies move into the Iranian highlands, they are burning and destroying and pillaging and topple over the ancient fire temples dedicated to the Lord of Light, Ahura Mazda. While they recount the destruction of their provinces and their civilizations, it's a curious thing that neither the Romans nor the Persians seem to attribute this to religious motivation. There doesn't seem to be a religious impulse that they're describing on the part of the Arab conquerors. Holland even seems to suggest that Muawiyah I was some sort of heretical Christian, and that the earliest rulers of the caliphate, based on all the evidence, not even really what we would consider today Muslim at all. Mr. Holland then describes the second fitna, the second civil war, discussing Marwan I's short rule and the end of the Umayyad Caliphate. The civil war between Ibn Zubayr, who is the first Arab ruler to have the Shahada printed on his coins, and this is about 50 years or so after the alleged death of the Prophet, versus Abd al-Malik. And it's with Abd al-Malik and the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate after him that we see the first epigraphic evidence of the name of Muhammad on coins and on buildings. The first mention of Mecca in its present location comes from 680 during the rule of Abd al-Malik. The first, as I mentioned, epigraphic evidence of Muhammad comes from coins of Ibn Zubayr and Abd al-Malik, and the Dome of the Rock, which is constructed in about 690 AD, over 60 years after the death of the Prophet, is the first time the name of Muhammad is inscribed upon stone that we have record of. It's Abd al-Malik who in fact centralizes power in the caliphate and introduces truly Islamic coinage, where the faces of the emperors or the Islamic caliph is no longer on the coins of the currency, but it is in fact just words that are on the currency. And so it's really Abd al-Malik who seems to break with earlier Roman and Sasanian tradition, which had the image of the ruler on the money. And that would be consistent with a now truly Islamic ruler. And so Mr. Holland proposes the very provocative idea that the location of Mecca as the place where the sanctuary that Muhammad builds, which is called Baka in the Quran, the location of that in present-day Mecca, as it's called, the writing of the Prophet's name on the Dome of the Rock, the strict monotheism that you see in Islam today, the changes in the coinage, that perhaps what we know as Islam today does not come from the alleged Prophet Muhammad, but that the Prophet was a history piece that could be used by the Caliph Abd al-Malik to substantiate his rule, much in the same way that Virgil wrote about Romulus and Remus to help establish the rule of Augustus Caesar over the Roman Empire and to provide a justification for Caesar's titles that ended the Roman Republic. Perhaps Abd al-Malik's usage of the name of the Prophet and of the Shahada and of the coinage and the sanctuary that he had built or built up in Mecca after capturing it from Ibn Zubayr, perhaps this is Abd al-Malik using these legends and these stories and the names of people who had come before him to establish his own rule. And what's interesting about Abd al-Malik is that I believe he's the first caliph to actually be born after the lifetime of Muhammad. And so Mr. Holland proposes that perhaps it's Abd al-Malik who is indeed the true founder of Islam, and that perhaps instead of Islam giving birth to the Arab Empire, it was indeed the Arab Empire that gave birth to what we now know as Islam. This is the provocative thesis that Mr. Holland puts forward. Whether or not it's true, it's hard to say. Mr. Holland himself acknowledges his skeptical, secular, and Western bias in approaching the question. He talks about the stories of Abraham and how important they are to Judaism and Christianity in addition to Islam. And as a secular agnostic, he calls into question, the historicity of much of the Old Testament. And he asks, the question, what is more important, the history or people's perception thereof? He said more people have died for visions of heaven than for historical fact. But one thing that he leaves off at the end of his documentary and at the end of the book is perhaps the true untold story of Islam is not the traditional story that has been told, but perhaps the more fascinating story is what may have actually happened in history itself. And so with that, I conclude my review of Tom Holland's book, In the Shadow of the Sword. I'm currently doing an audio book listen through his book Dominion, which is the one that I hope to review next. I highly recommend not only his books, but his History of Everything podcast. I will say, as a believing Christian who has supernatural presuppositions, I disagree with Mr. Holland on some of his conclusions in this book, as well as some of his conclusions on his podcast, as well as in some of his other books. But that I find him to be a very, very engaging historian who asks lots of good questions. And as a man who's even come to recognize his own secular biases and has seen those secular biases as actually deriving out of Christianity instead of the classical world, I find him to be about as honest as a man can be, coming from an agnostic background. He leaves off at the end of his documentary, Islam, the Untold Story, perhaps the search for the historical Muhammad, the place of the first sanctuary, and how Islam arose out of the Arab Empire. This is the fascinating tale of a whole new story that we're just now starting to scratch the surface of. So with that, I thank you for your time. Looking forward to podcasting more here in the year of 2023. Let me know what you think. I invite all points of view, Christian, Jewish, agnostic, Muslims as well, who might stumble across this video. I welcome your interaction, your pushback on the theses that are offered in this review. And I'm looking forward to engaging with all of you as the audience further. And so with that, we'll leave out with the intro and exit music from Samuel Sim, Desert, once again. Thank you.